While I will try to give some perspectives from industry, I can really only give a perspective on behalf of SOBI, as I am the CEO there. SOBI, as you may know, has an almost 30-year history in hemophilia dating back to Kabi and Kabi-Vitrum, moving on to the invention of Refacto while the labs were under Pharmacia. We're still the manufacturer of Refacto AF, as some of you may know, and began work on the current grouping of long-acting factors, FC8 and FC9, in 2005. We were joined by our partner Biogen IDEC in 2007 in the development of those programs. And if we're successful in coming to the market here in Europe in 2016 or so, it will be the end of an over 10-year effort to bring those products forward. I say all of that to anchor for you the idea that SOBI is not new to hemophilia, and to make a contrast between the expertise at SOBI and the expertise in this room and my own expertise in hemophilia. I am not an expert in hemophilia, and I don't come from the hemophilia industry. I have spent 10 years or so working in the rare genetic disease world. I spent almost all of my time in pharmaceuticals before joining SOBI as the CEO 2 years ago at Genzyme, where I worked with really rare genetic diseases. And so what I'd like to do is give you a sense for where I'm coming from that world, and give you some reflections on what we're hearing so far about how you as a community are thinking about the introduction of long-acting factors in the future, and indeed for new therapies of any kind in the future of hemophilia. And I hope that after a short set of comments, it will give us some good material for a discussion in the Q&A in the coming period. From a rare disease perspective, I think the mission and vision of a company like ours can be described in a very simple way. We have the ambition to develop and deliver innovative new therapies to patients with rare diseases. And the vision, I mean, vision can be anything, but the way we think about a vision for what it would be like to be successful in this endeavor, it would be to essentially take advantage of the fact that rare genetic diseases are present at birth. And if you think about it, that gives you the greatest potential to transform disease that there is. Because a patient, a baby, at birth, even with a genetic defect, has a potential for normal life and for an entirety of normal life. And what would have to be true to make that possible? You would have to be able to diagnose that baby at birth. You would need to associate their diagnosis with an effective therapy, and you would need to be able to deliver that therapy over a lifetime, making adjustments for what they needed at different times in their journey through life to maintain the effectiveness of that therapy. And crucially, you would need to make that therapy sustainable, in other words, available through a lifetime of therapy. The way we think about that vision is of sustainable transformation of a patient's experience of their disease. If we were able to achieve that vision, and when I say we, I don't mean we as a company, but we as a community, we would essentially provide a lifetime of benefit by working together to make this transformation sustainable. Coming to hemophilia from the rare disease communities, which in many ways have modeled themselves on the experience of hemophilia, I expected to encounter what we're seeing here in these 2 days at this meeting. There is an incredibly unified and strong community of stakeholders who have a shared commitment to making this transformation real for hemophilia patients around the world. And as my experience over the last 10 years has shown, this combination of payers and governments, committed physicians, and activist patient community members is what's required to really take the steps not only in developed markets, but in earlier markets, as we've seen starting to happen here in Romania in the last couple of days. So I start there by giving you a bit of an outside-in perspective on where hemophilia is today. And I think what we've heard throughout the day today suggests that a transformation indeed has occurred in the treatment of hemophilia over the last 30 years. Most patients are diagnosed at or near birth. Almost all patients who receive that diagnosis can be reliably associated with an effective therapy. And I think for the first time today, we're seeing a new generation of patients with hemophilia or people who happen to have hemophilia who are in their 20s and 30s and who have never experienced a bleed. We heard this morning from several of the clinicians the challenge that that represents to patients who've never had the experience of the primary symptom of their disease. That's a totally new problem that's coming from the general effectiveness of the therapies that exist today. And Dr. Nathwami just gave us the potential to imagine a future when we might say to each other at a party, I think I had hemophilia once, I'm not sure. I got a shot for it when I was a kid, right? That would be the ultimate realization of this vision of transforming the patient journey with a rare genetic disease. So the question that I'm asking myself and that we're asking ourselves at SOBI is, what's left to do here? What can we add to this field, which is today in possession of such an incredible luxury of choices? In most rare genetic disease fields, we're still looking for somebody to make the investment to come and help. And here we have such an abundance of choice today. So I think at the same time that we think about all that's been done, it's really important that we listen to you to understand all that can be done in the future. Let me tell you what I've heard so far as a non-expert from you. The number one challenge that presents a barrier between the current transformation in hemophilia and its sustainability is a lack of equity. That today we don't have equal access to these transformative therapies, even within developed markets, and certainly not between developed markets and emerging markets. If we're going to have a sustainable transformation in hemophilia, we have to address that problem as a community. No one company can do it, no one country can do it, but we have to do it together, and we have to acknowledge today it's the single most unaddressed problem in hemophilia. The second is that we are operating, even in modern, mature markets, in an environment of scarcity. We are treating patients with hemophilia with the least worst option, if I can use that non-English word. In other words, we're treating with the minimum factor possible to get the best imaginable outcome. Of course, it's not how we would treat if we weren't in a scarcity mentality. So what would be possible if we weren't limited in our thinking about the way we give therapy to patients in this community? Thirdly, from an advocacy perspective, have our past successes presented us with some degree of a challenge going forward? In other words, if we ask people who are not in our community in hemophilia today, is there unmet need? Is there a job left to do in hemophilia? I think many would say hemophilia is well covered. Hemophiliacs are well treated. They are living a normal and full life. And you don't have to look very far around in this room and with your colleagues in any country you can visit to find examples of people who are not well treated, who are not living full lives. But it's an advocacy challenge for us as a community to make those remaining unmet needs clear. And today I would argue they're not clear to those who are outside of the community that we're in. And lastly, I hear a lot about the challenges of adherence. Not because prophylaxis isn't instituted early, but that it's hard sometimes to maintain in certain contexts around the world. And we have to think about how to make prophylaxis sustainable over a lifetime and different life phases for patients throughout 8 decades of life. The long-acting factors, in whatever form they ultimately come through the approval process, will have to be very attentive in listening for how to meet some of these outstanding challenges. They're a tool. And so far, based on what we know about the FC factor 8 and FC factor 9, we can imagine the utility of this tool in patients who are treated today on demand, in patients who are treated with prophylaxis for those going into surgery. And in a very interesting way, I can imagine that the characteristics of a longer-acting factor could be particularly well-suited to the needs of patients in the developing world today, who often are traveling many, many hours with an active bleed before they can get access to even inadequate levels of factor. But how these tools are used and how they make a difference depends on an effort that we all need to make to understand how they should best be applied. So whereas I'm sure that I could tell you what these are exactly going to be used for in the best way, I'll almost certainly be wrong. And in this 2 years, during which the United States will have access to these therapies if they are approved next year, we're going to learn a lot about how to best apply them. And we'll be looking in that period of time to take the lessons from the US experience and to continue to work with you, both patients and physicians, to understand where and how they should best be applied. Having said that, I think it's worth making a few comments about some of the components and concerns that Brian and others have stressed about what will happen here in the next 2 to 3 years before we're able to come to the market in Europe. So I'll just share what's on my mind. The number one thing for me that I'm concerned about is the review process with the EMA. Not because the EMA can't and won't review these in the fastest way they can, but the fact is that the EMA today is taking between 14 and 16 months to review orphan drugs. And the fact is that that 16-month review time will add significantly to the already 2 to 2.5 year delay between US access and European access. So we will do everything we can to work with the EMA to move through the review process as quickly as we can, but it's an unknown today for us. So the number one question that I receive from patients and physicians is, when will we get there? And that's one of the most important things that I'm thinking about in our work. Secondly, from the point of view of the orphan drug designation, I think this idea of an all-or-nothing introduction of long-acting factors to the market is really an important one, and it's not one that, from my perspective, we would see as beneficial for us or for the community as a whole. And I would say that the view that Brian raised earlier around the idea that if the orphan drug designation is granted, it'll likely be granted on a platform basis, on a technology basis. But we have no control over that. We don't know how the COMP will judge these things. And they have moved. They have changed their view of how they will define and engage around exclusivity over the last 10 years. So it's an important topic for us, and we have the same kind of interests and thinking in our minds as was outlined by Brian earlier. Thirdly, we're thinking a lot about reimbursement and value. And Brian rightly pointed out that payers have only a limited set of tools to use to understand the value of new products. And to the extent that payers believe that this is a community that's 100% satisfied with existing therapies, their urgency and engagement to provide these therapies will be less. So if the answer that we come to in the coming couple of years is that there is a need, there is a role for products like these, it will require a joint effort to make the case for the reimbursement of these products as they come to the market in the next couple of years. And lastly, I think it's important that we remind both ourselves as we think about all that there is to do in the future, and also when we have our discussions with payers and others, that what we're watching today is the evolution in the hemophilia community of the very best of what healthcare innovation has to offer. We obviously have a lot to do still, but the reality is, as a rare genetic disease, hemophilia is so far in the lead ahead of others, and it provides a really inspirational model for all of the other rare genetic diseases that are following in its wake. And I think one of the challenges that we often have is to think of ourselves on the other side of the table from our colleagues who are payers. At the end of the day, payers are just as confused and feel just as much pressure to get these solutions to work in the best way as we are in industry, as you are, and maybe in the patient community. And I think we have to find a way to win together and to describe the results of these kinds of products and work that we've been doing as investments in health. Because for that baby who's born with the normal potential and the ability to diagnose a genetic disease at birth and to give a lifetime of normal life, the return on that investment is extraordinary. And we have so many living examples in this room and elsewhere of patients who've had that kind of outcome. So we can't lose sight of that in the discussions that we have in the years ahead. So how we will continue to transform hemophilia is an open question. And exactly what the role of these long-acting factors will be in that transformation, I think, is also open. But I feel very optimistic that we're going to find places where we can raise the bar for the kind of outcomes and access that are needed to take the next step in hemophilia. A question for all of us to work on together, as I've heard very clearly in these couple of days, is how to make that next step in this transformation sustainable. So we will stay in touch, and we will have many, many conversations, Brian, with you and others before we come to that time. I think the next speaker, Karen, is going to speak to some of these issues that are really tough to grapple with, how you understand and express the value of new therapies. So look forward to your talk as well and to the Q&A afterwards. Thank you.